Hello, in our group tutoring on Monday, we were discussing the differences between rational emotive behavior therapy and cognitive therapy. And we had a little bit of confusion between irrational beliefs, which go with REBT, and cognitive distortions, which is how cognitive therapy explains pathology and what's going on when people are dealing with things. And so I was asked to provide a little bit more information in distinguishing between these two. And I thought that I would just create a short video highlighting some of the similarities and differences, and then also providing some specific examples. And so here's some similarities between irrational beliefs and cognitive distortions. Both lead to emotional distress. And so irrational beliefs with REBT and cognitive distortions with cognitive therapy contribute to negative emotions such as anxiety, depression, or anger when people misinterpret or distort their reality. Obviously, this is why people would come into counseling, and this is kind of what we're assessing for when we're working with them. Both also involve faulty thinking. So both approaches deal with faulty thought patterns that misrepresent reality, whether through rigid demands, which is the irrational beliefs, or more habitual and biased thinking, which would be cognitive distortions. Unfortunately, both can be challenged and changed. Obviously, that's why we're doing therapy. Both irrational beliefs and cognitive distortions are modifiable through therapeutic techniques such as disputation with REBT and cognitive restructuring with cognitive therapy. So disputation is when we are helping the client to dispute those irrational beliefs. And then cognitive restructuring is when we're replacing the cognitive distortion with one that is more in line with reality. Some key differences between irrational beliefs and cognitive distortions are that irrational beliefs tend to be more rigid and demanding. A lot of times they'll be expressed using an absolute like must or should or ought. These beliefs are seen as core ideas that dictate how people view themselves and the world. They're fixed in that mindset about how things are. Cognitive distortions, on the other hand, are more automatic and habitual patterns of thinking that distort specific situations. So these are not generalized across the board, but they're more confined to a specific experience or situation. They're not as rigid, but they're based on biased interpretations that vary from one situation to another. Another key difference is the demanding versus exaggerating. So irrational beliefs demand that reality conform to a person's expectations. I must succeed at everything. I have to do this. Cognitive distortions exaggerate or distort reality. So, for example, catastrophizing a single event into a major disaster. So it's more isolated to a specific experience or situation that's happening. And then, of course, with rational emotive behavior therapy versus cognitive therapy, the approach is directive versus collaborative. In REBT, therapists tend to be directive and confrontational in challenging these irrational beliefs and encouraging clients to adopt more rational alternatives. And in cognitive therapy, therapists use a more collaborative approach, asking clients to evaluate evidence for and against their distorted thinking. And often this is done using Socratic questioning. So let's look at some examples of these differences. So when we're dealing with clients who have perfectionism, this is how an irrational belief might show up. They might say, I must be perfect in everything I do, or I am worthless. So the explanation here is that this belief is rigid and absolute. The word must shows that the person holds a demanding and unrealistic standard for themselves. Any failure to meet this standard results in a self-worth being questioned. And the emotional consequence, of course, is that the client may feel anxiety or depression when they inevitably fail to meet this impossible standard. And so with cognitive therapy, we might see a cognitive distortion that falls in line with this all or nothing thinking. If I don't do this task perfectly, I'm a total failure. And so this is a distorted black and white way of thinking. The client perceives anything less than perfection as total failure, which is an exaggeration of the situation. There's no middle ground. So they're not a total failure just because they don't do the task perfectly. And so the client might feel discouraged or frustrated because they're seeing their performance as completely negative based on one imperfection. So that's the all or nothing thinking. Okay, so what about with fear of rejection in relationships? If we're using an REBT approach, the belief might be, I must be loved and approved of everyone in my life, or I am a worthless person. Again, this belief expresses a demand for universal approval. It's linked to the person's sense of self-worth. If not everyone loves or approves of them, they see themselves as fundamentally unworthy. You see how it's rigid. And so the emotional consequence is that the person may experience anxiety or low self-esteem due to this pressure that they feel to meet this unrealistic demand. With cognitive therapy, the cognitive distortion might be mind reading. I just know that if I ask this person out, they'll reject me because they must think that I'm unattractive, right? So you see it's situational. This distortion involves assuming what others are thinking without any real evidence. The client believes they know how someone else perceives them, which leads to inaccurate conclusions. Emotional consequence being that the client may feel fear or self-doubt, which could prevent them from taking social risks or engaging in meaningful relationships. Okay. What about dealing with failure? So here in REBT, the belief might be, if I fail at this task, it means I'm a complete failure as a person. This belief links self-worth directly to success in tasks, making any failure a reflection of one's entire identity. It's overly demanding and unrealistic. This one doesn't use the word must or should, but it's kind of implied in there in this demanding sense that I must not fail. The emotional consequences, the person may feel shame or worthlessness after a single failure, seeing it as a personal indictment rather than an isolated event. If we're looking at a cognitive therapy approach, the cognitive distortion might be overgeneralization. Because I failed at this one task, I'll fail at everything that I try. So here we've generalized to everything what's happened in this one specific situation. This distortion involves taking one failure and applying it to all situations. Even if it's not logically connected, the client jumps to broad conclusions based on a single experience. And so the consequence is that the client may feel hopeless or discouraged because they believe that failure in one area means failure in all areas. Okay, and with anxiety about future events, another example. REBT, the irrational belief might be things must go exactly as I planned or it will be a disaster. The word must indicates demanding a rigid expectation. The person believes that if things do not unfold exactly according to their expectations, catastrophic consequences will occur. Okay, so here we have this rigid and demanding way. Things have to be this way. They must be that way. And so the person experiences intense anxiety when things don't go perfectly according to their plan, as they believe that the outcome will be disastrous. With cognitive therapy, here we have catastrophizing as a cognitive distortion. If this presentation doesn't go well, I'll lose my job and my whole career will be ruined. Okay, so we've taken this one isolated incident and catastrophized it. So the client assumes the worst possible outcome for a situation, even if the likelihood of it happening is very low. They magnify the consequences of a very small mistake in this one situation. Client feels overwhelmed and fearful due to exaggerated nature of their thinking, believing that one poor presentation will ruin their career. Okay, last example, dealing with criticism. If we're looking at it from an REBT approach, the irrational belief is that I cannot tolerate being criticized. And if someone criticizes me, it proves I'm inadequate. This belief reflects an intolerance for criticism and links self-worth directly to others' opinions. It shows a rigid demand for approval. The emotional consequence being that the person feels deep distress or anger when criticized, as they see it as a threat to their value as a person. And then if we're looking at cognitive therapy, the cognitive distortion might be a personalization. So the distortion is that my colleague's comment during the meeting was directed at me because they think I'm doing a poor job. So personalization occurs when the person assumes that external events or comments are directly about them, even when there's no clear evidence. This leads to feeling unnecessarily targeted by criticism. And then the emotional consequence is that the person feels hurt or defensive because they've taken general criticism or comments personally, believing it reflects negatively on them. So hopefully that's a helpful way of looking at these differences. If we're trying to understand these counseling theories, really having a good handle on how irrational belief is tied with rational emotive behavior therapy and how cognitive distortions are connected with cognitive therapy. hopefully being able to understand these differences will help you to do great on the NCE. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions. You can find me at NCEExamPrep.com. I'm here to support you as you try to prepare for the NCE. Thanks so much.